Well, it's not official yet, but I feel pretty confident in saying Ukraine is over. The Western media has moved on, and frankly, they're not even holding up the narrative that, oh, the Ruskies are on the run. Zelensky is a great military leader. He's, the greatest leader since George Washington. And he's going to lead the troops to victory and push those Ruskies out. The Ruskies are having such a tough time. They never knew how hard it would be. There are thousands of Russians dying every week. The Ghost of Kiev has shot down approximately 500 Russian planes as of this point. All that nonsense, for the most part, is gone. Most of the Western media, or at least in the United States, I guess I shouldn't generalize because I haven't read the British papers lately, and the British media was, believe it or not, even worse than the American media on the war in Ukraine, as far as just being absolutely, out there in Looney Tunes land. But the American media has pretty much dropped the Ukraine story. Ordinary Americans, if you talk to them, they haven't thought about Ukraine in a couple weeks, and if they have, it's been to wonder, gee, I wonder what's going on there. I haven't heard anything about it. The U.S. media is not talking about it. They've moved on to gun control and mass shooters and white supremacy. The old bread and butter. And if you've noticed, I have too. I haven't been talking much about the war in Ukraine, and that's because there's, it's not a whole lot to talk about until this past week, where we are seeing, I think, definitively, the Ruskies are turning the tide in Donbass. The stalemate is, I think, broken. I think it's safe to say that at this point. And that's not really in dispute by either side. The Western media is no longer maintaining this narrative that the Ukrainians are holding back the Ruskies. For the last few days, CNBC, which for those of you who don't know, that is a mainstream business news TV network, cable channel here in the U.S. So I think CNBC also has an international channel, although I don't know how widely it's available or really if anybody watches it. But CNBC main audience is here in America. You have the New York financial markets. Of course, you also have Chicago. And so CNBC has to be a lot more realistic with their news coverage than, let's say, MSNBC, which is the regular cable news arm of NBC News. MSNBC gets to have people like Rachel Maddow and that dweeb with the glasses, I forget his name. Chris Hayes. That's it, Chris Hayes. I kept thinking Ed something, but it wasn't. It was Chris. And CNBC, has certainly its fair share of clowns, but they're financial clowns. They're not really people who are clownish when it comes to the regular news. Like Jim Cramer says ridiculous things about financial markets. He told people to go out and buy Bear Stearns like 3 days before it went bankrupt. Or 3 days before it went zero. It might have already been bankrupt at that point. Yeah, and and you just watch him. He's got his sleeves rolled up. He's got bug eyes. He's going wild. He screams all the time. People have no idea how bad things are out there. But he's not a total Looney Tune when it comes to just normal politics or wars or things like that. And the same is true for most of the people at CNBC, because you have to, in order to have any sort of modicum of understanding of what's going on in financial markets, you have to have somewhat of an objective viewpoint of what's going on with the world, with news, because that's going to affect financial markets. This war in Ukraine having a big impact on the global oil market, which is having a big impact on every financial asset, pretty much. And so I say all this as a preface to the fact that for the past few days, I've woken up every morning with a notification from CNBC around 6 a.m. giving me an update on the war in Ukraine. And not a single one of these notifications since CNBC has started sending them out every day, or every 2 days maybe. I think it's every day, actually. Not a single one of them has been positive for Ukraine. It's always something about, Russians captured, 3 more villages yesterday, and Zelensky, as we call him because we can't say the letter Z, You can thank Alex Christoforu for that. Hat tip to him. He was the one who pointed that out, because the letter Z has been canceled. We all know that. So President Zelensky, don't say Zelensky, he had something, not so positive to say, like, it's a really tough situation over there in Donbass. Don't look over there. And this is what I've been getting from mainstream business news, CNBC. And so CNBC, I would say, is like the cutting edge of mainstream news. It's not that they're ahead of everybody else. It's that, they're moving in this direction because it's so obvious, and they're covering the business news. They have to. And so in time, you will see even outlets like CNN and MSNBC starting to come to this realization. Alexander Mercurius of the Duran has been pointing out a similar phenomenon for longer, for actually the past couple weeks. He has pointed out with the Financial Times, which is a business newspaper based out of the UK. He's pointed out that the Financial Times has had a less rosy view of the war in Ukraine, and now I'm noticing it here in America with CNBC. Then, of course, there was the bombshell, I don't like to use that term too much, but it's true, the bombshell report from the Washington Post, which was basically about how low the morale is of Ukrainian troops, how they feel like they've been abandoned, how they just feel like they're cannon fodder, they're lambs led to slaughter, they're handed out, stand and fight orders. They're saying, hey, you need to fight to the death even though they have no chance of winning, and they feel like they have been completely abandoned by their leadership in Kiev. And so there's not a whole lot of debate left about how the war is going in Ukraine. It was, for the longest time, there was a media war going on. Yes, Ukraine was losing the war on the ground, objectively, but they were always have been winning the media war, because the Western media in all these countries have been propping up saying, yes, Ukraine is winning. Yes, Zelensky is a wonderful, brilliant military tactician. He's so brave and so wonderful. And his wife is such a regal first lady. Oh, and look at his olive drab t-shirts. Doesn't he just look like a man of the people down there in the trenches with his men? And as the media has moved on to other topics, and they're no longer interested in the character of Zelensky, and by character I don't mean like his personal character. I mean like his character on TV. He was the star of the news for a few weeks. He was selling newspapers. He was getting eyeballs on Pfizer ads. And so that's what he was good for. But then the media eventually, people started to get a little bored with that, and the media found other narratives to try and attract readers and viewers. And right now it's the whole shooting in Texas. That's the new hotness. And so they don't have as much reason, at least they don't have the same selfish, profit motive to push the Zelensky myth, the myth of a victorious Ukraine, as they did before. That story has run its course. News cycles move pretty quick in America, and they can only do so much to hide the truth and to lie about the war. I mean, if two countries are at war and one side is losing, you can't pretend that the other side is the one that's losing, forever. Because eventually the war is going to be over, and we'll know for certain which side was winning the whole time, and based on which side ends up actually winning. And once Donbass falls, the dirty little secret is that the Ukrainians, it seems, have they've pretty much bet all the marbles on holding on to Donbass. Their troops are dug in there. They've got everybody there, and if all those troops are either killed or captured, as the Ruskies take over that region, there's going to be relatively few soldiers, certainly very few well-trained soldiers and well-equipped soldiers, to defend the rest of Ukraine. And so once Donbass falls, the Ruskies will be able to flood and conquer as much of Ukraine really as they'd want. The people who really are standing in Russia's way right now are the troops in Donbass. And as they continue to just hemorrhage troops and territory they become less and less an effective fighting force. Now, if the Ukrainians had decided to, set up, strategic withdrawals and hold off the Ruskies for as long as they could, but ultimately pull out their men before they were completely encircled by the Ruskies and before they were completely annihilated and cut off, maybe they could have held out a lot longer. In fact, I think that when all is said and done, that will be the main gripe, probably from veterans of this war, is the way in which there was no option for the Ukrainian leadership of ever pulling back and trying to regroup. Once their lines are broken, they stay broken, and they don't recover. And that's because, for the sake of the narrative war, the Zelensky regime refuses to accept any loss, even if it has to be a temporary loss. And any losses that they do incur, they deny. But they certainly, won't let anybody surrender and regroup and try to fight another day. They'd rather their soldiers fight to the death. And you can only do that so much before you reach a tipping point and your whole charade begins to collapse. And it appears at this point that the Zelensky regime is spiraling out of control. I mean, he's even trying to lock up Petro Poroshenko now, the old anti-Russia president who was there for a few years after the Maidan coup. He presumably should be on Zelensky's side in the war, but now he's going to infighting and trying to just take out anybody like Poroshenko, and I don't really understand why. And if he had some real legitimate gripe with Poroshenko, you'd think that they would put it off until after the war, maybe. But honestly, once the Ruskies consolidate their control over Donbass, I think that this will get very interesting. By all indications that I've seen, from all the people that I watch who pool sources and things and just comb over as much information as they can about this war. I don't claim to do that myself. I watch a bunch of other people, principally the Duran, but there's other folks too, who I feel keep themselves better informed than anyone else in the world on this topic, and I form my opinions based on that. And the consensus seems to be that Kiev bet all or nothing on Donbass. And so far, because they put all their resources there, Donbass has been able to hold out for a couple of months. But it seems that when it comes down to it, they're going to go full Azovstal. And they're not going to pull these guys out. They're just going to wait until they're completely encircled, which potentially has already happened. I mean, I was talking about that very early on. What was it called? The Cauldron in Donbass. It could be really that these guys have been cut off for a while. Because I talked about it back then, hey, why don't the Ukrainians pull some folks out of this area? Because, I mean, again, Donbass should be the least desirable part of Ukraine for the central government anyway. If they're going to try and, pull back and just defend some of your territory, give that up militarily. I'm not saying you have to give it up politically yet, although ultimately that's what will happen, but try and defend some of your country. And they just didn't seem interested in doing that, and now I think they're facing consequences. It's probably too late at this point. Even if there was like a coup, or if Zelensky had a change of heart and decided, let's pull these guys back and just try to, protect the West. Let's try to protect the part of the country that we have the best claim to, and that the Ruskies, would have the least interest in, because the Ruskies seem pretty well determined to take all this territory here. And moreover, they're in that type of a position, you would think that the leadership in Kiev would try to negotiate some kind of settlement with the Ruskies if they know they're going to lose anyway, so that they don't have to waste the lives of however many tens of thousands of soldiers potentially. But again, getting back to that Washington Post article that I mentioned. The Ukrainians don't really have much concern for the lives of their soldiers. They're willing to throw these men's lives away. And because of that, it might buy them, a few more weeks, because it does take time to saw through that many human bodies. But eventually, Zelensky's going to run out of human shields, and there will be nobody left standing between him and Vladimir Putin. And so since, Ukraine from the beginning was always at a disadvantage and was never in a position to decisively defeat Russia or push them out of their country. It was only a matter of time, and how much pain they could inflict on the Russians before getting out. Ukraine's only leverage that they had was in trying to negotiate as early as possible to say to the Ruskies, hey, let's settle this at the negotiating table before, we both incur a lot of losses. And that would have been appealing to the Russians, because obviously the Russians have incurred a lot of losses as well. There are families who have lost loved ones in this war on the Russian side. But because the Kiev government refused from the beginning to make any concessions, the Ruskies are just going to ultimately take whatever they want. And so I think the extent to which Ukraine is thoroughly defeated will be quite shocking to a lot of folks in the West, who were told initially that this was not possible, and yet here we see it materializing before our eyes. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.